Welcome everybody to this evening's keynote lecture by Robert Hutchison. Excuse me. Rob is a practitioner, researcher, and educator whose interests and practice overlap with the fields of architecture, art, and photography. After working for Miller Hall Partnership and serving as a principal of Hutchison and Mall Architecture, in 2013 he established the architecture studio Robert Hutchison Architecture. He is an affiliate associate professor in the Department of Architecture at the University of Washington, where he teaches architectural design studios at both the undergraduate and graduate levels. He is the recipient of numerous honors and fellowships, including a 2017 Rome Prize from the American Academy, a 2022 McDowell Fellowship, and the 2009 Emerging Voices Award by the Architectural League of New York. Well, it's a pleasure to have Rob here present his work in another capacity than what he's been here all week, where he's been involved in leading a Project NL workshop. So thank you for being here with us. We look forward to learning more about, elegance and economy and the space in between. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Is this working? No? How about now? Is that better? Thank you, Solomon. And thank you Solomon, as well as Juan and the Berlage for the invitation to come here. It's been really amazing I've been here since Sunday. I guess I arrived Sunday. It's been great to be with students and seeing the work that's happening here, being a part of the conversation, and I have to say, pretty impressed by your facility. This is definitely the largest screen I've ever presented to. But I always start my talk off with introducing my staff. I think it's really important that we acknowledge that architecture is a collaborative effort, and so I always introduce my staff from left to right. Rachel, Michelle, of course I'm in the back, Xiaoxi in the middle, Forrest in the front on the right, and Scott in the back. We have long conversations in our studio, and I try to include them in all of those conversations in whatever way we can, and they are, an equal part of the output of the work. So even though my name is on the door, it's really important that I acknowledge them. And just to sort of frame a little bit of context of where we work and how we work, I'm based out of Seattle. This is my tiny studio that I built in 2006. It's 43 square meters, and there's typically 6 or 7 of us inside this little studio. So it's very intimate. It's very conducive to talking a lot about the work, but also requires that you have a sense of humor and that you all get along. But it's located behind my house. I just like showing this slide because I've been working this way for probably, over 25 or 20 years now. Basically in my backyard. That's my house that my wife and I purchased in 1996. We raised 2 children in the house, and they recently left, and now it's just my wife and I again. And again, my studio is a 10-second commute from my house, and we have a lot of fun and try to build as much work as we can. With lots of ideas. So when I got the invitation to come here, I was in conversation with Solomon about what would I be talking about, or what would be beneficial to talk about, and Solomon was pretty quick to respond, being interested in this sentence that we have written on our website. I wrote this sentence probably 5 or 6 years ago, and it was not something I came up with, actually. It's an observation that a good friend of mine had on our work, an architect friend. And he saw something in our work that was of interest to him, and that was that it seemed like we're always trying to find economical ways of doing things. And when I use that word economy, I'm not interested necessarily in just talking about cost. Inevitably, I think a lot of our work is cost related or impacted by cost because we work with a lot of low budget clients and projects. But I think over the years we've become really interested in simply being efficient in what we do because we think it's the right thing to do. But at the same time, it's always challenging to figure out like how do you become, or where does that, how do you deal with efficiency and economy but still bring a level of quality out in your work? So when he asked me to, or proposed that I talk about this as a lecture, I've never done a lecture on specifically this topic. And at first I thought it would be an easy thing to frame, and once I looked into our work, I sort of started having a difficult time figuring out how to talk about it. But one thing that helped me was to look back on a lot of the projects that are important to me in my education as a student and moving into my career as an architect. And so thought I'd use those projects that I think we're always looking back to. Most of the projects are ones that I've... Oh, did it? Like a loose connection?
Yeah, I think so.
I'm going to keep talking. But I'm going to show a few projects that are, hopefully I'm going to show a few projects that are of interest to me and were really inspirational to me, and I think, again, are things that we look to still to this day regarding this idea of economy and elegance. Yay. So when I started thinking about this very specific projects that I knew were things that we're always looking towards, they then started becoming more specific relative to the topic at hand. And for many of you, maybe these are obvious things, but for me it was really, they say that a good reason to do a talk about your work is you learn something about your work. But one thing we spent a lot of time on is the plan, and always trying to figure out ways to create a more and more efficient plan with partly with the idea of trying to create less impact on the site, but also out of that it becomes more efficient in the use of materials and in the end for the project. One of my really amazing experiences in graduate school was to be in Norway for 3 months on a scholarship, and this is a project that I had the privilege of seeing in 1995, again when I was a student still. This is Villa Schreiner by Sir Fehn, one of his first buildings. I think this was built probably in the late 60s. Of course, I think everyone knows Sir Fehn, but Pritzker Prize winner from Norway. And it's got a really beautiful story behind it. It's a very small house, one of his first commissions, commissioned by a husband and wife before they had a family. They purchased a beautiful property at the edge of Oslo, and they wanted to grow a family there and live and die there. And of course, they didn't have much of a budget, and so Fehn put together this very small little building, and I've always loved the emphasis of the core of this house, sort of this solid brick core that contains all of the plumbing inside of it, the kitchen, and then 3 very efficient small bathrooms that allows 3 people to be taking or getting ready in the morning, or 4 people. And then around that core is the series of bedrooms and living spaces, which are all a post and beam frame with views looking out to the site. One thing I've always, actually let me try using this. Don't know how to use this. Woo. I've always loved this moment here where he designed it so that, so let me back up. So they had 3 children, as I understand it, that grew up inside this house, and then the kids left. When I was given a tour of this by Mrs. Schreiner herself, her husband had just passed away. But it was really interesting to hear her talk about how her children were able to use all these bedrooms, and as one child would leave for college, another child could open up this bedroom and make it their own. simply through this simple way of planning of thinking about how sliding doors could pocket into that slot in the core. And so we spent a lot of time trying to find those places where we can have spaces that become more flexible. That idea of a very simple plan or an efficient plan is also complemented by a way of always thinking about changing the section throughout our buildings. Something that I learned very strongly from this amazing building by Peter Markley, also one of his first commissions, I believe. A museum for a sculptor, Josephson, I believe is his name, in the south of Switzerland. Again, very, very elegantly simple, long floor plan that you see at the top. Can you see this? Yeah. And then with these little chapels, if you will, where individual works would be stored, but with a section that would be changing all the way through the length of the building. And then using skylights, only skylights at the top as ways to illuminate the interior. The other thing I love about, love about some of these buildings, especially like this building, is that they're so fundamental. There's no building systems, there's no envelope considerations, and I think that that's a pretty powerful way to think about buildings whenever we can. Another theme that became interesting to me was to think about, we're always thinking about how can we do more with less. I sort of like a spin on, instead of less is more, asking this question of how do we do more with less. This is a project I have not been to, but a firm that we've been following for a few years now called Bast out of France. And I just love the simplicity of this project and I don't know much about this project because they don't talk about it on their website, but the graphics illuminate what they're trying to do, where they have two existing buildings. And the brief, presumably, is the client asking how do they connect those two buildings, and their solution being this one very simple way of connecting the two buildings with a third volume or a third space, and that third space can be transformed through a curtain that can be closed or opened. In Seattle especially, and maybe throughout Europe as well, but in Seattle we never have the opportunity to work with brick or concrete in many ways because of cost. It's just not a technology or a tectonic that's used in Seattle much. It doesn't mean that we don't build that way, and there's more expensive work that can afford that, but in our work, we never have the opportunity to do that. We're always working with wood construction and materials like plywood and drywall. And this building in Japan by Jun Aoki, the Aomori Museum of Art, is just an amazing building that I had the privilege to see in 2010 when I was there on a fellowship, and I recently just saw it again. And it's a really incredible building because I actually did an interview with him, and we talked about this building together. He had a very tight budget, but a huge program, and his solution was to use a lighter weight method of construction with steel and framing. But what he was interested in doing architecturally is to create an architecture of mass. And this idea of using other materials and treating them as mass, I think, is an interesting way of thinking, which is something that informs the way we work with wood construction. I think this is one of the best contemporary buildings in Japan. It really is an incredible one. Another thing I've thought about over the years is thinking about buildings as either watercolors or oil paintings. When I think of Carlos Scarpa's work, I think of an oil painting building. Nothing wrong with that, but one where he's always like building up like an oil painting over and over again, trying to figure out what he's doing, drawing, detailing over and over again. But then I'm intrigued with thinking another way of working, of what I would call more like a watercolor, more like a sketch. And a project that I've always loved is Sigurd Leverentz's flower kiosk. When you look in the archives of Leverance's work, this is one of his last buildings. There's no drawings except for very simple construction drawings. He knew what he was going to do. Of course, he had been working for a long time. He was in his 80s. But I just love how quickly he developed this building, and he through experience, he already knew what he needed to do, and he did it. Leverance shows up for us often. Again, I'm sure people know his work, working out of Sweden, but the idea of using one material and that minimizes the number of details that you require, maybe not necessarily in this building, but the fact that, the idea of this building and the idea of only using one material is something that we're always interested in looking at to minimize the number of details and therefore the cost of the building. And then a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but another Leverance building, just doing one window. I think this is just an incredible building, the Chapel of Resurrection in the Woodland Cemetery in Stockholm, where it's this very strong, opaque building in the classical style, of course, but then really honing in on one element. It's something that we're always looking at doing, trying to figure out what is the one thing that we're going to spend a lot of time on, and that's where we invest both our time and the budget on the building. So it was interesting because I haven't shown the first two projects I'm going to briefly show I haven't shown in a very long time, but it's interesting to go back and look at our work from over 20 years ago. My first project, a metal shop. This is an addition to a existing two-story wood frame building in Seattle for a general contractor. And the general contractor asked us to design a metal shop with a parking deck on top. And we were actually the fourth architect that he had hired in a year, which was a little scary going into it, but we were young, we needed some work, and we took this on, and we knew that we had to come up with an idea that was, come up with it quickly and build it quickly, because this guy had already gone through 3 architects and he just wanted to get something built. And what was interesting about this project is that we had a subterranean, so this dashed line here is the bottom of the metal shop. This is an elevation, the only drawing that I drew actually in the conceptual stage of this project. Cut through the alley. There's an alley alongside the house or the property that goes down to a street down here, with the idea that at the top of the alley you can bring trucks in on top of a parking deck above the metal shop. And so he needed this parking deck. All the trucks needed to be kept on top of that parking deck where the alley was below grade or lower than the parking deck. And then we had a residential property across from us, so the zoning code required that we screen the parking deck. And I've always loved this quick solution that we came up with. Oh, and also, of course, we wanted to bring light down into the metal shop. And so our solution was a single skylight that was constructed out of steel with a steel frame. You're not seeing the glass on the skylight, which is facing south, but that these skylights sort of march along the alley. They serve the purposes of keeping the trucks on top of the parking deck, and of course bring light down into the space below. They also, the city approved them as a means of screening the parking from the neighbors to the west, the residents to the west. And then something I always love and something that was important to us is that we create something beautiful out of this one move. So in this case, one element that is accomplishing 4 things. This is a construction photo before we had finished the project, using those skylights to wash light down inside the concrete wall. Another earlier project where we're using just 2 elements to create a series of different spaces. This is a writer's studio adjoining a house in West Seattle. And in this case, our client wanted a very small 10 square meter writer's studio, but her husband wanted a work yard, and he also wanted a place to smoke a cigar. And so in this case, very quickly we became interested in two architectural elements: a wall that radiates around and turns in on itself to create the primary program of a writer's studio, but also setting up a smoking area, a covered smoking area at the deck, and a work yard, with that wall separating the garden from the work yard itself. And then a second architectonic element of a folded roof that we only looked at quickly through model, very quickly, some different ideas of how we might pull this off. And in this case, my own watercolor building, where we only drew a floor plan and an elevation. And then we did all the details on plywood with the builder, which then got covered up by the siding. I mean, this is a while ago, but I think we had a budget of like $30,000 on this thing and pulled it off. So here's the little, so in this view, you're looking into the writer's studio before they finish the interior. The folded roof that comes across and covers the smoking area. And then the wall that separates the garden from the workshed, or the workspace. More recently, a project that unfortunately never got built, but one that's always been dear to us, that I think carries a lot of the themes that I've been talking about, is a project that we call Hover House. This is a dune site, actually similar to the students we were working with. This is along the Pacific Ocean, overlooking, or along the Pacific coast, right on the Pacific Ocean. A dune landscape, and the two things that we were struggling with, or that we had to sort of deal with, is one, how do we minimize the disturbance on the dunes and minimize our foundations and footprint on the dune landscape itself. But also, this is a landscape now, especially with sea level rise, that's experiencing more and more storm surge events. And so the idea of trying to situate a building in this landscape, which could also address conditions when you have a storm surge, and how do you do that? And we became interested in looking at things like the seagulls, where or in the surf, where they have this ability to have waves pass below them. And that came up very quickly with this idea of how do we set up a foundation system and then a superstructure that sits on top of that. And this idea of foundation and superstructure, I think, is sort of a recurring theme in our work, something that we're always interested in thinking about. How do you establish a foundation, and then how does that foundation support a structure above it? We do iterate a lot, so here we're just looking at a lot of different formal ways of hovering this building in the dune landscape, always with a common idea of a foundation. At this stage, a common idea of two foundations that allow for storm surge to pass underneath the building. And then the sort of final drawings, or the presentation drawings. Again, this project unfortunately ended up not getting built. Our client decided they didn't want to deal with these neighbors here that were becoming a real issue in the project. But here you can see the coastline and the dune landscape that we're situating the building in. We were talking with the students about how this is, even though this is a flat landscape, there is still a section to it, and the importance of drawing that section, including the vegetation. And then here, a very efficient floor plan. We're always interested in thinking about how you get circulation to occur or arrive at the center of your plan, and then use, once you have arrived, that you have choices of various places to go within the building. In this case, situating the living, dining, kitchen space on the view side, obviously, and then the more private spaces behind that space. But even like here, just thinking about how do you get 4 bunk beds in, Our client asked us to design a cabin that they would be comfortable in for 2 of them or for 14 people because they would have friends come over. But then taking advantage of lifting the building up off of the ground condition and thinking of ways to utilize that space, in this case, setting up a condition where you are actually within the dune landscape itself and being covered by the belly of the building above. So here you're seeing the entrance coming up and arriving at the middle of the or the heart of the cabin, and then always playing with the section, trying to always enrich the section as much as we can to create a spatial narrative. We always liked how that belly of what I call the belly of the seagull really frames that horizon beyond. Very recently, we completed this addition to a house in Seattle. In Seattle, we have a lot of craftsman buildings from the 1920s, 1910s to 1930s. Usually a single story, very simple little gable. This is a house owned by a couple who asked us to build an addition with the idea of extending the interior living dining kitchen space into a longer space with the idea of trying to connect more strongly to the yard itself. So in this plan, the roof plan before and after, north is up, and then in the floor plan, north is to the left. So basically, again, very simple little building, probably 80 square meters, existing floor plan. And what we were intrigued with was the sort of length and narrowness of this living dining kitchen space. And in the addition, we proposed to essentially extrude that space all the way through into to create a much longer living dining kitchen space, using a stairway that steps down to establish a connection to the backyard. But there is a very strong motif in this building from the 1920s, again, of these archways at all the doors that you see in the transverse section here, as well as the longitudinal section, and then here's a transverse section to the existing house with these funny arched openings, and so we sort of picked up on that language, and in our addition design, we continued that motif with a new opening between the original and the new space, and then carried that through into these various skylights that bring light down into the space. So again, sort of picking up on Markley's work indirectly, very long, simple floor plan that then changes its section throughout the length of the building, starting with the existing building and then carrying all the way through to the back. And so this is my example of where over the last 5 or 6 years, we've definitely started working more and more in using mass, if you will, sort of light heaviness, and thinking of that as something that we can carve away at. But in this case, it's just drywall and framing. So this is looking from the new addition back towards the original kitchen, whereas this is from the original kitchen looking back towards the new addition. So you can see the new aperture, the new threshold, if you will, between old and new, and then this light scoop, ways of trying to bring in eastern light along the face of that wall. This is Juan's image. Just wanted to credit you, Juan. But again, sort of treating this solid, tall wall as mass, if you will, and then various ways of thinking compositionally of how you carve away at that to create a deck or a loft space up above, or looking into the mass into the bathroom itself beyond. So this is a really important project for us that we completed 4 years ago, called the Rain Harvest Home. It's actually in Mexico, or outside of Mexico City. This is a collaboration with one of my best friends, Javier Sanchez, really amazing architect based out of Mexico City. He and I have been really good friends for 20 years now and have collaborated on a number of different projects. And this is a project that he asked me to co-design with him. The site is to the west of Mexico City, about 2 hours on the other side of this volcano. So in this view, we're looking east towards the city with sunrise coming up, and this amazing view of the volcan Toluca, the Toluca volcano. And what's interesting about this project is, well, I think there's many things that are interesting, but one of the really important parts of this project was that early on we made the decision to try to create a completely off-the-grid retreat, if you will. It's basically a retreat. And a really important part of it was collecting rainwater and treating rainwater, gray water and black water. What people don't know about Mexico City, if they haven't been there, is that it's actually pretty high up. It's about 7,500 feet in the air, and actually has a quite cool climate. But also, for 6 months, it has very, very heavy rains, and then for 6 months, it has a pronounced dry period. So the difficulty is having enough water to get through the dry period of 6 months. If anyone's been following what's happening in Mexico City, they're having a huge problem with this very issue of dealing with the dry season, and they just had a really horrible drought. The irony being that they have all of this water they can collect for 6 months, and then that should be enough for you to be able to get through the dry months, but the city is not set up to deal with that. So this became a little bit of an experiment and sort of a laboratory for Javier especially. This is his own place. But what you're looking at here in this diagram is, you can see this reservoir here. That's a reservoir that we actually dug on the site. And what we're doing is we created 3 buildings on the site, sort of trying to push or take the program and spreading it out across the site with the idea of encouraging people to walk through the site. And then all 3 of those buildings collect rainwater on their roofs that is piped underground to the reservoir. But then we're also using the pathways that we use to get around through the site as ways to channel water into that reservoir. So over the course of 6 months, we collect all of that water in a pretty deep reservoir. That becomes storage, and that is then piped over into a treatment room where we treat that rainwater as potable water. But then we're also collecting all of the black water from the buildings and treating that to gray water. That gray water is then piped over to treat water the garden. And so it becomes this whole cycle where we're treating all the water and we're completely off the grid. We don't have any well water that we're tapping into, and we're not connected to the city water system. The program is three buildings, if you will, what we call sort of the living pavilion. This is just a conceptual section, but the living pavilion, the bathhouse, which is separating all of or giving you 4 different bathing facilities or rooms that I'll talk about in a bit, and then a studio building. So this is the living pavilion, if you will. Actually, a quite large footprint, 300 square meters, but the beauty of this building is that it's almost all exterior. The only sort of interior portions are these 2 bars, one being the bedrooms, and then this other one being one with a small bathroom and washroom or maintenance room. And then the living dining space occurs between those 2 bars with sliding glass doors that can be pushed all the way into this long, narrow bar, with the idea that when those doors are open, this whole entire building feels like it's all outdoors. And again, it's actually a pretty cool climate. In the rainy season, at night it's quite cold. But we have no heat in this building, so we just shut it down and you get a blanket and go to sleep. But then during the daytime, it warms up, and part of the idea was to give them a way to always be in the sun and sort of track with the sun like cats. So in this case, this floor plan it's a little strange because we have the north is down, with the idea that we wanted to show the longitudinal section below the floor plan. And then a main feature in this house is, a very low horizontal pavilion with 3 skylights that are sitting on top that bring in 3 different types of light. Eastern light for one of the bedrooms, western light for another bedroom, and then the main skylight monitor being the important one that brings in southern light down into the living and dining spaces, especially during the wintertime. The bathhouse is a very simple little round pavilion building that is set up with 4 different bathing spaces. So we have a sauna, a changing room, a steam shower, and then a hot therme, like a hot bath that you can go down into. In this case, again, so all 3 of these buildings use all the same materials. All the detailing is the same. All the framing is the same, but the shape of each building is different. But in the second one, we also have skylight monitors that bring light in from above. But in this case, no windows at all in the spaces themselves, because we wanted people to walk through this amazing landscape, come into the center, and go into each of these spaces, and then close the door and only have natural light from above. And then in the center is an opening to the sky, which looks, when you're inside the cold plunge, you look up through that aperture to the sky. And then the studio itself is this tiny little double height space with a small bathroom, like a little bathroom on one side of a breezeway, and then a sky room on top of that, with the double height space in the studio itself. And this we sort of envisioned or thought of as just a monitor itself, with the idea that the whole building is the monitor, or the skylight monitor that looks up to the mountains. We just had the photographer Alain Binet shoot this for us last year. I'm not sure if people know of her work, but she's an amazing photographer who I got to know a few years ago, and we managed to get her to come to Mexico, and so she spent a week with Javier and I just photographing this project. And so we haven't published these yet, so it's the first time I'm showing these. She just put this PDF for us together, and so I thought I'd show a few of her photographs. And I'm actually meeting with her next week to select final shots, but these are all by Alain. And she's always, she only works in film. In this case, she's working with 6x6 and 4x5, black and white and color. So it's sort of a mix of different photographs. So here you can see the reservoir in the foreground, and then the living pavilion beyond with the steel skylight monitors that sit on top. This is one of my favorite photographs that she took, because it really shows how this project is all about letting the architecture completely disappear and just having it be a way of living on this property or occupying this beautiful site. Here you're seeing the light from one of the skylights coming in from above. All the interiors are all wood. So this space here is the living dining space with the doors in a half-closed position, the glass doors, and then we have a pine wood siding that we stained black. So when you're inside this space, when those doors are all open, it feels like you're completely outside. A lot of our buildings are black, and it took me a little bit of time to figure out why we're doing that. But one thing that really happens is the buildings really do recede, and that black becomes a way to frame an aperture of the site beyond. This is the south-facing skylight, so we just kept the wood framing going through, and then we placed the skylight on top with the idea that the wood framing would become a sort of like a lattice or a foil to filter the light down. And then the bathhouse, which again is black, stained black siding, which then with the apertures sort of are ways of framing the landscape beyond. So all three buildings share the same material vocabulary, the same floor system, the same black siding, and the same wood framing for the ceiling. But then the spatial and formal relation or resolution of each is completely different. And then the studio, again, sort of thinking of it like one huge skylight monitor that frames views up to the mountain beyond. And then her last shots here are of the site itself, the site walls, and the garden, as well as the water features that help channel the gray water to the garden itself. This is the water feature at the entry. So all of the black water is being treated in the underground machine room, and then that black water, after it's been treated, it becomes gray water, which is then brought to this water feature at the entrance, which then feeds the garden. How am I doing time-wise? Okay. 10 more minutes? 2 minutes? 15? Okay. It's good because I wanted to show this for Yessi. I showed my students this the other day, but this is a project that's so. And Juan wanted me to talk about this as well. We always have conceptual work in our office that we're working on, which is really important to us because it keeps us thinking about things that we can, or gives us an opportunity to think about things that we can't think about with our clients sometimes. It's not the easiest thing to do this work because it costs money to pay my staff to work on it with me, but again, it's become really important over the years that we always have something like this in the studio. I was given the privilege of a fellowship to Japan last year. It's actually the same one that I got in 2010. Last year's was 4 months long, so I was in Japan, and I was there to study. I had become really interested in the crazy concrete tsunami wall infrastructure that the national government had been building for 10 years since the terrible 2011 event. The 2011 earthquake and tsunami, which is located, the majority of the Tohoku coastline in northern Honshu of Japan was affected by that event. And so while I was there on research, I decided I would go for a long walk, about 750 kilometers with a camera, with the idea of documenting this infrastructure. So the photographs that I'm showing here are part of that walk. I'm just going to sort of scroll through and maybe once in a while say something about it, and then after this I'll show a project that's coming out of this photography project. So here's a tsunami wall. This is the largest construction project in the history of Japan, and in 12 years they completed who knows how many kilometers of tsunami walls. And the idea is, of course, that they're trying to prevent loss of life in a future event, but it's a pretty controversial project because they're building these huge walls that are separating the communities from the very thing that they're there for, which is the ocean, because these are all fishing villages. So basically I had a backpack, a 40-pound backpack, and a medium format camera, and I just walked, typically maybe 35 kilometers a day. It took me 5 weeks. In this case, I knew I wanted to. I'm very interested in photography as a medium. I didn't have any idea of what would come out of that, except that I knew it was important to walk and document what I saw. One thing that became pretty clear for me pretty quickly was that these walls occur at a really important part of the landscape for any culture. That moment between land and sea is a really important threshold. And in this case, these walls are public space, but people can't occupy them very easily, typically. And in such a crazy landscape of loss and trauma, it became a pretty heavy thing to think about, and I did have a chance to meet people, talk to them sometimes about this. This is actually a photograph taken from the land side. You have these crazy moments where you have stairs that go up. This is a 15-meter wall with a fishing harbor on the other side, and these stairs are not here for people to access the beach on the other side, but rather when the tsunami warning sign goes or signal goes off, the fishermen have only a certain amount of time to get into the harbor, and they've already closed the gates, and so these stairs are for them to get up over the walls to try to get to higher ground. I had mentioned to the students when I was presenting the other day that some of these photographs are sort of surreal because they almost look like I photoshopped these walls right in over these beautiful landscapes. One of the things that was very strange was to realize how beautiful, I'm not sure if that's the right word, but compositionally and architecturally these walls have a certain quality to them graphically, but then they're so violent in this landscape, and so that this sort of weird overlap of beauty and violence was something that was interesting to try to sort of grapple with. So while I was doing this walk, we being my studio and I, had already been talking about our interest in this infrastructure that is designed for only one purpose, and that is for a future event. And we just became really interested in thinking how that might be how it would be important to try to figure out ways that it's not just a single purpose infrastructure. And so we decided we would start to think about different ways that this infrastructure could be adapted for other uses. This is a completely speculative project. We've worked on 3 different schemes. And I'm just going to show this one, which ended up being a cenotaph for the victims of the earthquake and tsunami. Cenotaph being a memorial for bodies that are not at this location, they're elsewhere. In this case, many people's bodies were never found, which is a pretty tough thing for a lot of people for the family members to deal with. This is an actual site that was probably the tallest wall that I saw. It was 15 meters tall. One of the few actually that you can walk on, but it was a bit of a strange thing of this beautiful, huge bay and river delta that was completely crisscrossed by this huge wall. And I became interested in thinking about, well, how could we make... What became interesting to me was to think about how this could be spatial, and that these places could be simply a way to allow people to occupy this place between land and sea. And with the idea of this being more place than just this violent concrete wall. What you're seeing here is a sort of a funny drawing. A lot of times when we're working early on, I like going pretty quickly into a working drawing. In this case, you're seeing a section, obviously, through the concrete tsunami wall. On the left is a section through the proposal, a longitudinal section through the wall. On the right, an elevation, and then ghosted in is the beginnings of a plan. And the idea here is that we became interested in providing people the opportunity to either stay at the height of the wall or to be able to go down into the wall with the idea that this timber structure that comes up out of the point in the wall that we've carved into recalls the pine forests that used to be on this site. Almost all of the pine forests that were along the coastlines were all taken away by the tsunami. So there was this idea of thinking about how the quality of light coming down through this structure might recall that notion of the forest. So here you're seeing beginning ideas of how maybe suspended from that structure of stacked wood, which is using a traditional Japanese way of stacking wood called hanegi, and suspending from that a hovering walkway that allows you to stay at the height of the wall, or if you choose, you can go down below that condition and sort of, the idea was to try to place you in between land and sea and remove you from both of those things, only revealing the sky and the filtered light through this. And then these are our presentation drawings. We just did an exhibition of this project in Seattle a few months ago. Site plan showing this huge gate at the river and then the wall that keeps going. And then the location of our proposal at the bend in the wall. The site section. That's the gate of the river beyond. An exploded axonometric that we're always using this as a way to try to understand parts to whole. And you can see here this idea of a ramp that slowly carves down into the wall and then comes back out of it. We're hoping that this, we're in the process of publishing this right now as a book, and we're hoping that this is going to be moving as an exhibition to Japan next year. Do I have time for one more? So I'm just going to finish on another project, another conceptual project. This is one of 8 houses that we designed for a site that's very important to me. It's a site in Eastern Shore, Maryland, a site that my parents used to use or own. I didn't grow up on it, but they lived on it for about 15 years after I went to college. And there was something about this landscape that was just, I found really compelling and beautiful and stayed with me. And then sort of a hard, it requires 2 lectures to talk about because it's very personal. It came out of my father's own dementia and my grappling with how to deal with that. And so there's a connection to memory, my own personal memory, but also the loss of my father's memory that is related to this project. What you're seeing here is the house that they used to own right here, which you can see up on this beautiful meadow or sloping meadow that goes down to a river. And then over the course of 5 years, we designed 8 different buildings that investigated at an architectural level the typology of a house. So we have a roundhouse, or we have a house for a train engineer, a roundhouse for locomotives, a chapel, a winery, a Caroline Tower, a boathouse, a house for a widow, because my father passed away during this project, and so I designed a house for my mother, and a lighthouse. But I've loved this project, and it's just another example of the importance of this kind of work in our practice, which then feeds back in some way. It's like a feedback loop. In some way, it feeds back into our built work. In this case, our interest in typology, and this shows a little bit more of our process. Here we're just becoming fascinated by typology and how we everyone thinks of a lighthouse as being a tall, slender tower, but there's lots of different ways of doing a lighthouse. And then in this case, always looking at context and the local conditions. This is the typical Eastern Shore, Maryland lighthouse, which is all a product of where you are. So in this case, we have really loose sand and mud that they have to bypass with a foundation system that are drilled steel piles. And they create this foundation that then allows for the superstructure of the lighthouse itself to be placed on top of. But also thinking about the qualities of these buildings in their surroundings and the ideas of reflection, or the qualities of reflection. Here we are trying to, just at the beginning of the design process, trying to understand what we're trying to do through maquettes and models. That's important to our process. Always referencing art, in this case, Brancusi, the bird. This is, I forget her name now, amazing photographer, really beautiful work, who photographs African women in their traditional dress. Marianne, architectural precedents that we're always looking at, in this case, Marianne Ray's amazing documentation of various underground buildings in Rome. This is the Well of St. Patrick, which is all about circulation, double helix ramp that goes down for one horse or donkey to go down to get water while the other one comes up. So a building only for circulation. Very early drawings as we're trying to figure out what do we want out of this building, and in this case, an interest in a building that might sometimes disappear and reappear, or in this case, a building that disappears into the sky. And then realizing that we want this building to feel like it's actually moving through the landscape, which then changed the geometry of the plan. I was in Rome at the American Academy in Rome when I designed this, so I was being influenced by all these amazing things that I was seeing, including Borromini's beautiful little chapel, and using the geometry of that to inform the geometry of the floor plan of this building. Here in the working drawing, you can see a plan superimposed over the elevation with the idea of a double. So here everything's sort of coming together. The well of Orvieto is coming together as a tower of circulation with a double helix, using the geometry of Borromini, but also the typology of the Eastern Shore lighthouse on these stilts. You can see that photograph of the woman from Africa and her dress sort of showing up in some ideas. And then the final drawings. We ended up designing this facade that is closed down at the bottom, but then starts to slowly open up to the point where you get up to the light, where it's completely horizontal louvers. And then the presence of the boat, thinking about how the boat and the building itself are one, and how the experience of getting to this building is across the water. Juan did a beautiful film for us on this, related to this project, that's worth looking at. If I had time, I would have shown it. Where, again, it's a project that I could talk about for a long time, but I had these memories from 20 years ago of this site, and I couldn't get back to the site, so we designed all these buildings with my memory of the site, and then after we did all of these renderings and were complete with the whole design of the project, we were able to get access to the site, and so Juan and I actually went to the site and filmed the actual sites, and then merged in his film the video documentary with the renderings themselves. This is looking up, obviously, to the light. And then it was exhibited in Seattle, and then also was a solo exhibition down at Casa Barragan in Mexico City in 2018, I believe. And we published our book, Memory Houses, at the same time. So really amazing series of models created by Xiaoxi in my studio. And I think that's it. Sorry I went so long.
Thank you very much.
Any questions?
There are some questions.
Hello, thank you for the lecture. I wanted to ask, it seems there's a very deep exploration and documentation and research in these latest projects that you showed, while you talked from the beginning of a more straightforward approach to the build projects you showed, no? So how do these phases interact in the office, or if it's just the way that you presented the projects, but is there really a similar process behind the build projects? Can you expand a little bit on that?
No, that's a good question. I would say no, it's not the same process. Partly because, you know, when we're most of the sort of built projects that we have tight budgets, we have schedules that are crazy. I mean, maybe not dissimilar to what other people deal with, but in our case especially, we're sort of in the trenches trying to turn things around quickly, and so we've sort of developed over the years a way of working that allows us to quickly get to that point. And at some level it is somewhat pragmatic. And maybe because of that, we do this work. I feel like we don't have the chance to talk about certain things that as a studio we talk about in this conceptual work. And I think it does somehow feed back into the built work. I don't know exactly how typically, but there have been moments where like literally there's a floor plan and a way of thinking of a floor plan of the chapel that we designed that informed the house next door to my own studio that we designed. So I think that's partly why we do it. We do it for two reasons. We do it because it's important to us that we have that outlet to be able to talk about work in a way that maybe we can't always talk about with our clients, and that's fine. Like, it's okay that we can't talk with our clients about that because that's just the nature of the work. But we need that outlet. And then we do know that it's a feedback system, that in some way it influences the work. And for me, it's not important too much knowing what that feedback is, as long as it keeps us going. Does that answer it?
Yeah, thank you. Well, just to complement the question, would you wish that to be able to get that deep research and documentation for your build project as well, or do you like also the pragmatism that results from?
I'm sorry, I didn't follow this.
Do you wish that the build projects that you've done would have involved a similar process of research or documentation, or do you appreciate or like the pragmatism and like a different approach to things that you did?
I mean, no one's ever asked me that question. I mean, I would be lying if I said that I wouldn't wish that we had more conversations with our clients about deeper ways of thinking about architecture than we do. We do once in a while, like there's the occasional project when you click with a client and they're looking for something that is a lot deeper than maybe some of our other clients. And if I had a choice, would I have all my clients like that? Maybe, but we don't. And I do think that there's something really interesting, just like the watercolor building. Like, I think there's something really interesting about having different ways of working and different timelines, and it's hard enough to build buildings, and it takes so long to design and build a building. So for us, it's actually sort of refreshing to have projects that maybe have a requirement to be done quicker, and that there isn't maybe an intensive, deep conceptual discussion, but rather I don't know if pragmatic's the right word, but maybe more pragmatic than just, a long conceptual phase of discussion. And we're okay with that. And the work comes out of that, and that's okay. So.
Hello, thank you for the lecture.
Sorry, can you speak up?
Thank you for the lecture. Can you hear me? There is this constant presence of skylight on your projects, not only as natural light sources, but as an architectural element. Can you tell more about that?
You mean like a formal element?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are your design intentions behind it? Not only about the use of light, but as strong elements on the design buildings.
I mean, I'm pretty sure it changes depending on the project. I mean, the first one I showed, the 5 skylights, it was all about like, oh wow, these could be these really beautiful things that you walk by. And there's a nice story about that. My kids were 3 and 5 3 and 5 years old when we designed that building. And every day I had to walk them to school, and one choice was to walk by that building after it was built, and they would always say, "Daddy, can we go by the skylight building?" there's like intentionally there was this idea of giving a formal visual sculptural quality to the alley and we've had people even now, like it still exists, it's still there, and it's only 2 blocks from my studio. But even now, when people find out that we designed that building, they always say, "Oh my gosh, I've always loved those 5 skylights. Like there's something just really beautiful, sculptural about it." I don't think that the importance of the formal sculptural quality of those things is the same in like. Obviously, it's not that at all in the telescope edition, because the skylights are all flush on the outside, and it's simply that project was all about just carving away at the mass of the drywall to create a beautiful moment of light coming in. And then maybe in between is the rain harvest home, where there's clearly sort of a sculptural element, but those first and foremost came out of a way of looking at how light comes down into that space, which then created the formal condition. So I think it varies depending on the project and in our intentions, and the intentions change. Does that answer?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Your work is really beautiful. I think just the photography of it and actually like the work itself. And it was interesting to me that you started with economy and efficiency and kind of the practicalness. So I'm curious, how do you think those are related? Like the beauty and the economy, how are those related inside of your firm, or how do you teach those things also?
Yeah, you're asking a tough question that I don't think I've figured out yet.
Yeah, me either. That's what I'm asking, I guess. But
yeah, it's funny. Juan and I were talking the other day, and we started graphing. I should have taken a photo of our diagram. We did a little chart, and we had elegance on one side and economy on the other, and we started charting some of my work, and then we realized that actually. Or what I realized was that really I want all the projects to be exactly in between. Like I want them to be both. Yeah. And in the end, maybe the title's wrong. Maybe it's not between both, but rather how do you create something that's economical, which doesn't necessarily mean cost, but is as efficient, as simple, as minimal as it can be, but as interesting, as compelling, as spatial, as light-filled as possible. I mean, maybe that's what we try to do as architects, and maybe we're all trying to do that, but for me that's become a way of trying to operate, and always talking about things. Always trying to reduce something. First thing that we always try to do with our clients is take their program and cut it in half, because we just know that that's a good place to go from a sustainable point of view, from a cost point of view, just across the board. But it's tough. I don't know how to. Somehow, maybe it's just through the process of trying to create a beautiful building that's where you meet, and so you're trying to minimize things, make things more economical, and through that comes the result. I don't know. I'm not really answering the question. It's a good question.
Yeah, maybe your work answers the question in its own way.
Yeah. All good? Oh, one more.
Hi. Thank you for the lecture. I was wondering about the project in Mexico as well as the project in the dunes.
In the dunes?
Yes. How do you feel about touching these landscapes?
What?
How do you feel about touching these landscapes or working in this context? Because I can imagine it's hard to work in these environments because they're so beautiful on their own.
Yeah, what's interesting is the Mexico project actually is a compromised landscape. It's actually originally over the course of 50 years, it was used for various different agricultural things. Cows were there for a long time. It had to actually be, some remediation had to happen. And so for that one, it was actually all about trying to, of course, minimize our footprint, but more importantly, trying not to bring a bunch of utilities into the site and just letting the natural native plantings return. And what's interesting about that project is they've recorded that since not just our house, but there's a number of other projects in that reserve. It's what they call a reserve. Since those have been built over the course of about 10 years, the number of birds that have returned to the site is increased by 200%. So in that case, it was all about trying to make the landscape better and let the buildings be as simple and off the grid and not intrusive as much as possible. A dune one is an interesting one because we grappled with like how do you bring a building into that landscape and minimize its impact. For us, one way was to try to keep the foundations as simple as possible and only 2 foundations and then hover the building up above. So in the end, we didn't build it. So it's probably for the best.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Simple question. I was just curious, how do you transit from your workflow and like work mode to your regular life? Because basically it's the same environment. You work next door to your place, and do you have a specific ritual? Because for instance, if I remember correctly, it was Wittgenstein who was doing a morning walk before going back home and start working. What do you do in order to start and how to finish?
Coffee. I need my coffee.
Together with colleagues or alone?
Sorry?
Together with colleagues or alone?
Together.
With colleagues, with your employees?
Definitely alone.
Okay.
Now I'm always the first one in my studio. You saw from the photograph, my studio's like 5 meters away from my house, so I have an amazing commute. But yeah, my what's the word I'm looking for? Regimen, if you will, is pretty much the same of being the first one in the studio, and then I'm there at night all the time. I have dinner with my wife, and when my children were there, we'd always take a long break. My wife works down in the studio as well, so we have a home working environment. But yeah, I love work as part of my life. The studio is not just a place to be working, it's a place to read, and I always call it a studio because it's a place to study. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was just I was wondering if you ever felt the need to photograph your own buildings, your own projects.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I'm a good architectural photographer, and that's a short answer. But I'm actually more interested in having someone else photograph it because I think it's interesting and important for a different eye to see something in it rather than myself. So for the longest time, that was my way of operating it was important that someone else photograph my work, and I didn't feel comfortable photographing things. And now that I know more about photography, I have tried photographing our work a little bit, and I don't think it's very good. So, but in the end, I do, and I think it's good for someone else to come in and bring their own eye to it. So having Hélène Benet come in was a gift, and sure enough, we've had 6 photographers shoot that project, and she's the last one we've had come in and shoot it, and her work is completely different than what everyone else was seeing. So it's really beautiful. So,
thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture and a great body of work. Thanks.
Thank you.